Good afternoon and welcome to Houston and Texas Southern University.
Thank you very much, Brother Judon.
Ben, I've got a few questions and I hope we have some time to take a few questions from the audience. When did you first hear about Mickey Leland?
So, first let me just thank Texas Southern University. Thank you, Allison Leland, who's been a great supporter, to Patrick, who was, I don't know if the book would be very different if not for Patrick.
That's true.
And you as well. When I called you up and then I came into the archive, you introduced me to the archive. And so another person without whom this book would certainly not be the same. So I appreciate you all very, very, very much. Also, just being back at HBCU, driving through University of Houston is special, but when I arrive at Texas Southern, I feel like, okay, this is a place that I know. This is home. As a graduate of an HBCU, Howard University, I really appreciate the work that is done at all of our HBCUs. We really need to support them as much as we can. So I was 15 years old. I had never heard of Mickey Leland before. We were aware of the Black Caucus and what it had done in the anti-apartheid struggle. So we knew Randall Robinson with Trans-Africa and among my small community of politically minded teenagers. But I had never heard of Mickey Leland before. But so I heard of him through the news. It was Tom Brokaw, and I was switching. Back then we only had three news channels. And so, well, I think CNN was there, but I was watching those three. And so I was watching Tom Brokaw, and this was a point where Mickey Leland was, and the delegation was considered missing. And they were showing all this footage of Mickey Leland and really introducing him to the United States of America. And they had images of him in villages surrounded by children. They had him when he did his homeless protest, I believe that was 85 or 86 in Washington, D.C. to raise awareness for the plight of the homeless. They had him, images of him with Barbara Jordan. And most important for me, they had images of him with a dashiki on. This is 1989. And as a teenager who was very Africa-minded, he looked like somebody I would like to be. And so it resonated with me, and I followed the news story throughout the week until they ultimately found the plane. And so that was my introduction to him. Coming back now, let's see, 25 years, about 22 years. Thinking about my book project, it became so clear to me that Africa does not exist the way it doesn't exist now the way it existed then. Mickey Leland fit into a context then. There were other people like Mickey Leland. Not just like him, but similar to him. Africa was around. He fit into a context where people were engaged with Africa. It was on the news, it was in the community, it was on our t-shirts. But then cycling forward, it had disappeared. So the question became, why did Africa mean so much then? And why did it cease to mean something similar now? And I think Mickey Leland, as I tried to capture it in This Land of Plenty, really speaks to that question of why it meant something, how they leveraged it, and what we lost by not paying attention to Africa and foreign affairs generally.
So I want to get into the book, and if someone would bring me a copy, please. But being at an HBCU and understanding, thank you, that this is a scholarly work.
Right.
Let's understand how you got into education and in the discipline of history,
right,
and what that means to fit into a context for our students and our young scholars.
Sure. So the goal for me, I didn't really envision when I was younger that I would write a book like this. I didn't envision that I'd be a university professor. In fact, I didn't quite know what that meant. I grew up admiring the community scholars like Dr. John Henrik Clark, Dr. Ben. We would go to their lectures. Fortunately, I lived in Harlem at the time, so they were very accessible to me. I would see Dr. Ben speak quite often. So being a public professor was something I looked up to, but I didn't know how you got to that. So I went to school to be a high school teacher. So I went to Howard University. They had a 4+1, so you can go for 4 years, get your BA, then +1 you can go and teach for a master's in education, and that was my plan. But then I got into the research. I had some fantastic professors at Howard University who really were rough on me, were tough on my papers, but taught me what it means to conduct research. And I was taking classes mostly on Africa and African American history.
So you majored in history?
I majored in history throughout. The goal was to be a history or a social studies teacher. But when we have the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University, which has these primary documents on the African and African American experience, and I just felt so comfortable there doing research, and I just felt like my mind was growing every minute. And it's humbling, and it felt good to be humbled. As they say, the more you know you don't know.
Right.
And that was an everyday experience, but it was empowering. And so conducting research was just thrilling. And then my professor, Dr. Haywood and Dr. Medford, said, you need to go to grad school. You need to go get a PhD. And so they helped me with the applications, and then I sent them off, went to the University of Chicago. And then my first book was on Africa, was a Ghana-centered study. But when I finished that, I said, I need to come. I want to come back to the African American experience. I had done a hardcore Africa project, and it was time to look at the African American experience from within the United States. And I asked that question: Why isn't Africa alive the way it used to be alive in African American politics and popular culture? And so I came to you. I came to the archive.
In doing your research, what were some of the significant things about Mickey's work, his public work, that some people may not know, or some people don't quite get it the way your research?
No, it's amazing to go through the papers and see how much he was involved with. I chose just to do the Africa piece. That's because of my background and my interest. Mm-hmm. But someone can come behind and do Congressman Leland and energy, mm-hmm. Congressman Leland and healthcare. There are files on Native American affairs. They can do homelessness. They can do poverty in the United States. He made a trip to Vietnam, which I discovered through Patrick, that couldn't be explored. So there's so much in there. And I didn't know that it was the largest collection of legislative papers in the country, and
that are online. And also Texas Southern University School of Public Affairs and the university with two congressional collections, right, that of Barbara Jordan and Mickey Leland. There's no university or college right. in the United States right. that has that large a collection, which you were the first one to really mine and produce a scholarly book.
Which I'm proud of that. But what I had to, in some ways, teach myself American history to do the book, because I'm trained in African history. So I study empire, study colonialism, study local politics in West Africa in particular. And then I just thought, perhaps through DNA, through proximity, through osmosis, I can just write on the United States history. But it's not that easy. This is about 40, 60 Africa, the United States. A lot of Africa in here, obviously. But I had to learn, one of the cases I make in this land of plenty is that what makes this generation of politicians unique is they bring that black power ethos with them into Congress. And it's a brief moment, but an impactful moment, a very important moment. So they're standing in solidarity with other Global South movements, seeing themselves in the Fifth Ward and the Third World as colonized people in the 60s and 70s. So they stand in solidarity with the movements in Southern Africa. They stand in solidarity with movements in Southeast Asia. And so I had to learn that. I had to teach myself that. For me, black power was more the sloganeering, the pride, black is beautiful, the sartorial choices with the clothes we wear. But there was a deep training and a philosophy and ideas that I really had to research to understand what Mickey Leland and others are trying to do inside and outside of Congress. And also, the struggles he's having. Mickey Leland rejected electoral politics at first. And it was really John DeMenil and others who pushed him in the early 1970s to run for the state legislature. He says he's considered himself a revolutionary. And if you go into electoral politics, you are endorsing this regime in the United States. So he wrestled with that. So understanding that history and that context took a different level of research for me. But it was illuminating. And then I could trace his line and say, so who is he following behind? And that led me to discover Charles Diggs of Detroit, who I didn't know. And the argument that I'm making, one of the many arguments I'm making, is that it's Leland who picked up the torch from Diggs, who was a congressman from 1955 to 1980. But he's really the one who raised Africa's profile in Congress, almost single-handedly. He's the one who's going to found the Congressional Black Caucus, which is going to lead to Trans-Africa. And he had his pillars. He's coalition building with activists on the streets, with activists around the world. That's one pillar. He's leading delegations to Africa. It's another pillar to raise Africa's profile. He's interested in famine relief in the Sahel, which was going on in the 1970s. And he rejects the Cold War as foreign policy. These are all things that Leland takes up in the 80s, almost line by line by line. But the difference that Leland has from Diggs in the 60s and 70s is he has a larger group of like-minded legislators in Congress with him when he enters in 79. And really by 82, 83, he begins to pick up his pace when he identifies hunger as a signature issue. So those are some of the things that I really had, that I identified that were impactful, that I had to do some context learning for, that I think really make Leland unique, but also make this book a unique contribution.
You said something earlier that I think bears repeating, because one of the myths and tropes that I've heard sometimes about, I call it Mickey Congressman Leland, is that, you know, he went all around the world to go help the people in Africa, but what did he do for the poor people in his own district? And he did a lot, even before he was elected to office.
That's right. That's right. And I heard that, and I read that he even had someone run against him. I forgot what year it was. The only time he really had a true, she was a school teacher.
That would be Elizabeth Spades, wouldn't it?
That sounds about right. That sounds about right. And that's one of the issues she raised, is that you are traveling around the world but not doing anything here. But since writing the book, and even in the process, I can't count the number of people who've come to me and said, you know, I say Congressman Leland, you all say Mickey. I'm not allowed, I don't call him Mickey. I call him Congressman Leland. I know that it's, he always said, I'm still just Mickey, call me Mickey, right? I still call him Congressman Leland. But people come up to me and they say, if it weren't for Congressman Leland, if it weren't for Mickey, XYZ program in the Third World wouldn't exist, on poverty, on education. If it weren't for Mickey Leland and his support, this program in the Fifth Ward would have existed.
How about generic drugs?
What's that?
Generic drugs.
And I got a card last night on a poverty program. And also the work he did, he was very conscious of the growing Latinx community in the 3rd and 5th Ward, in the 18th District in general. So when he came back, he was working with that community as well, and famously delivering that speech on the House floor in Spanish. So he was doing a great deal. Of course, that's not the focus of this book. I'm dealing with him abroad, but I think he purposefully drew attention to his international engagement. Again, going back to Diggs, when Diggs came into Congress in 1955, Adam Clayton Powell said to him, you could do all that radical stuff you want in Congress, it won't get the ball down the field. Focus on international affairs, focus on Africa, because they don't have that as much skin in the game there. We can be radical in foreign affairs in ways we can't be radical domestically. And so we could raise Africa's profile in ways we can't raise busing and blockbusting and redlining and not enough funds for TSU when you got funds for the University of Houston. But if you speak about the famine in Biafra, oh, okay, who's going to reject that? We can sign on to that. If we say the United States' most important partner in Africa is a racist regime, we have to speak truth to power. Oh, who's going to reject that? Speak the same language here, it doesn't get as far. So I think Leland adopting that model purposefully drew attention to his 7 delegations, his trip to Vietnam, his castigating Congress for not diplomatically recognizing Mozambique. He did that on purpose. And what he's doing domestically, other Congress people are doing, other legislators are doing. But he could be unique and stand out in international affairs. So I think in his time and since does not get enough credit for what he did at home. And he was amazing for being able to have that dexterity to do both.
So Mickey started as an activist in college.
Right.
I want you to reference that when we talk to our students today, and let me give you a second question on top of that. You know, the emphasis now in public education is STEM, STEM, STEM,
Right.
STEM.
Right.
History is not always discussed in terms of you can actually do well, live well as a historian.
Right, that's right. Right.
But there's something about history that is critical to the success of our communities and our people.
Right, absolutely. Of course, he's a pharmacist, or was training to be a pharmacist. I always say, if you're trained in finance, you could do finance. If you're trained in liberal arts, you could do anything. So it's something very important to remember. But as activists of that generation, and I don't want to come down on some of the movements today, but they were so multifaceted. There was never just a single lane for the movement in the 60s and 70s. Again, going back to this idea of whether you should go into electoral politics or not. But we are protesting on the streets while we're crafting legislation. We are opening clinics while we're forming solidarity with Frelimo or the ANC. And so, again, Diggs and Leland are doing all of that, understanding the importance of all that. But what they're also doing are forming study groups. It was also about shaping the narrative. We want, if Congressman Leland was not successful in getting his colleagues to sign on to a joint U.S.-Soviet relief program for Mozambique, which he tried, he would say, well, that's because they don't know enough. We need to form a study group, gather information, and teach people about the issue. That way they'll have no choice but to sign on. And that's a Black Power movement strategy. That comes out of the struggle. And that's something that they're doing in the movement in Algeria. They're doing that. The ANC is doing that. It's a radical agenda, but he's doing it in Congress. So the social sciences are very important. History is very important. He felt that if you shape the historical narrative, you shape minds. And that's why I think it's so, going back to what we're doing here at TSU, I think it's so important that our institutions have centers like the Leland Center, where we can control the narrative. They have to come to us for the documents. And then I come, and I'm a person who's of an HBCU, supporting HBCUs, and I could write the book. If we don't control our historical papers, and we don't control the narrative, we don't control our politics. And so this is something, again, that comes out of the movement. I think Congressman Leland was very, very aware of that. But I think today, we don't do enough of that broad reach in terms of the various lanes we take. If we're protesting, and again, the Freedom Riders and SNCC, they knew that. Before you go out there and protest, we have education, we have training. We understand the legacy, we understand the context. Then we go out there and do it. And I think that's why I think this period is so important, 60s and 70s, and then Leland brings that into the 1980s, into Congress, into the greatest power in the world. He's bringing an activist, third world agenda.
So, to the book. In this land of plenty, Mickey Leland and Africa in American politics, that in and of itself is an ideal and a mindful.
Absolutely. I struggled with the title. I had about 80,000 titles. The press, academic presses are historically horrible at choosing titles. They're very dry. So my wife had a list of titles. And I took this one, In This Land of Plenty, because I think it speaks to the struggle that Congressman Leland had. Being in the wealthiest country in the world, on one side, continuing to have hunger and poverty here. It just didn't sit well with his Catholic sensibilities. He comes from, he wasn't a Sunday morning Catholic, but he grew up with the Catholic Worker, the newspaper, and read the works of Dorothy Day, the idea of Catholic mercies, where if you're hungry, we feed you. If you're thirsty, we give you water. If we have some, we give it to you. And so it just didn't sit well to be in the greatest power in the world, the wealthiest power in the world, and we still have poverty and hunger. Also, if you are the most powerful country in the world, and you have so much plenty, and there is a historic famine in 83 and 85 in Ethiopia, and we don't respond to that, that's an outrage. So he gave a speech, and I have the epigraph in the introduction, where he's riffing on In This Land of Plenty. In this land of plenty, how can we have hunger? In this land of plenty, how could we have want? In this land of plenty, how could we not act when on our television screens we see want? And so that's where the title comes from. And that's a theme that runs throughout the book. I don't really dwell a whole lot on his Catholicism. I don't think he spoke about it that much. But if you understand the tradition of the Catholic worker and see how he's responding to issues, you see that it's resonating in him.
So, what is your approach for the book? What is the theme of the book? What does the book reveal?
Right. So initially I wasn't writing a Mickey Leland book. But then when I made the choice, I was initially I wanted to write on the 1980s and this question of why Africa was so important in the 1980s. And I also wanted to write about the end of the Cold War, because I felt the Cold War was so detrimental to the global South. So as we're coming out of the Cold War, what's going to replace it? And it looked to me at the end of the 80s is going to be humanitarianism. And so with Mickey Leland being so front and center with humanitarianism, it made sense to focus on Mickey Leland a bit. But then as I got into the archives, working with you and working with Patrick, he was doing so much that really represented that time. And I felt like I can tell the 1980s story of the end of apartheid. I could tell the 1980s story of Reagan, which he's sort of the subplot in the book. And I think one of the reasons why African Americans were so active, galvanized, unified in the 1980s was partly because of Reagan, and again, and South Africa. And we could also, his approach to Africa, reaching beyond South Africa to Mozambique, to Nigeria, speaking on Angola, speaking on, in particular, Ethiopia, was unique. So I felt like he was a nice narrative thread for telling this 1980s story. Now the struggle became, as a historian, as an academic, and it is an academic book, to keep Leland front and center at all times, which I don't. He disappears sometimes. When I'm talking about Ethiopia, he disappears for a little while. When I'm talking about the anti-apartheid movement, he disappears for a little while. But he's the thread that keeps it together. So what I'm trying to do is tell this story of how we get to the 1980s politically. And so in the United States and in African affairs. So I start in Houston. We started activism here in TSU. Not only in 1967, when we had the historic outrage of the police raiding the TSU campus, but a little farther than that to show why Houston's unique. And then I also go to Ethiopia at the same time. And I'm in Tanzania and I'm in South Africa at the same time to show that the student movement at TSU is part of an international student movement. Ethiopian students are up in arms as well. South African students are up in arms as well in Paris and in New York. Jean Locke was very helpful with that context. So I'm telling this domestic story and this international story. And then we get into the 1980s and we're saying South Africa's front and center, but Congressman Leland is reaching out to other parts of the continent to say that we have this consensus on South Africa. South Africa is an outrage. We can't have the United States government supporting the apartheid regime. But that's a kind of a racial lens, the racial way of looking at politics, and it's limiting. The argument I make is one of the reasons why we're not as engaged with Africa as we were in the 1980s is because we no longer have a race-based problem in Africa. South Africa is an easy villain. It becomes more complicated when you get to Darfur. Who are the bad guys? Who are the good guys? Abacha in Nigeria in the 1980s. Is he good? Is he bad? Rwanda is complicated. Who are the Tutsis? Who are the Hutus? South Africa is easy. And I think Congressman Leland saw that. And so he's trying to get his colleagues to pay attention to other issues besides South Africa. Let's get away from this racial lens for looking at Africa. We are obligated to act for different reasons. So that's towards the end of the book. He's really seeing the Cold War is coming to an end. African Americans need to be front and center on African affairs. Also, chapter 5, Reagan's leaving office. And we have Bush, who was a Texan, who Leland respects. And so there's an opportunity there. So he's paying attention to Sudan, paying attention to this conflict in Eritrea, moving away from South Africa a little bit. So I try to just tell how the changing meanings of Africa within African American politics and American politics, how the profile was raised, became centered on South Africa, and then the dangers of that lens, of being fixated on apartheid, being fixated on race as the connection between our two countries, and how Leland he's really seeing that. And unfortunately, he does not live long enough to see the turn of the end of the Cold War. And another argument I make very quickly is that it's Congressman Leland who brings about the end of the Cold War in the relationship between Ethiopia and the United States. What in chapter 6 is about the historic search for Congressman Leland. And people may not know that one of the reasons why he focused on in Ethiopia because it was Marxist. And as a Marxist country, the United States is naturally not going to have strong ties with it. His belief was that if we can respond to the famine in Ethiopia and resolve that food crisis there, the United States has the power to solve food crisis anywhere. Second part he's doing that I talk about in the book is that he's showing that the Cold War is bad for Africa, and it's not a real foreign policy. So when his plane, the delegation's plane, is missing in August 1989, George Bush, H.W. Bush, and Mengistu, head of state in Ethiopia, are in constant communication. There are no diplomatic ties between these two countries, but the president of the United States and head of state in Ethiopia are in constant communication, both singing the praises of Mickey Leland. Mickey Leland, if you go to Ethiopia, people know him. He's well known in Houston, he's well known in DC, but my friends in New York don't know Mickey Leland. But when I go to Addis, they know Mickey Leland. And they'll come to me and they'll say, in the 80s, Americans were the bad folks. They're the bad guys. But there was this one good person that Mengistu celebrated, and that was Mickey Leland. And so they're both singing Leland's praises as we have this joint search for this plane, the largest U.S. search for a civilian in history, for a civilian aircraft in U.S. history. So Ethiopian military, U.S. military joining together in this search, and that begins the thaw in ties between Ethiopia and the United States. Even George Bush says, it is this search for Congressman Leland and his colleagues that opened the door to diplomatic ties between our two countries. So it's not just that, but it's not just Leland, but the search for him, unfortunately, brings about the beginnings of reconciliation. And so this is the story I'm telling. It's a complex story, and I'm an academic. Sometimes we make small things and make them more complicated, but what I hope I've done is made, in a very accessible way, a very complex history of African affairs within the United States, what's going on the continent and what's going on here as well.
And of course, Ethiopia is now democratic,
right,
and is celebrating their first woman,
right,
president or prime minister. They have.
Yeah, she's the prime minister.
She's prime minister, so she's become head of state.
Right.
And the other thing I don't want to pass over, I don't know how Mickey did this. He was able to get $300 million out of the Reagan administration for famine relief in Ethiopia. Right. Nothing close to that had ever happened before.
No.
Nothing close to that has happened since.
No. That's true. And one thing I talk about very early in the book is that, again, Reagan is a subplot. And when I first started writing that, I just thought, again, coming from African history, having grown up under Reagan, Reagan's just a bad guy. He's a racist. But as I started writing and researching, he's far more complicated political figure than I understood. Very politically savvy, at least in the first term, very savvy. He comes in and he wants to reduce, that's what I talk about in chapter 2, he wants to reduce aid to Africa to zero.
Zero.
To zero. It was already very low. He wants to reduce it to zero. And so it's really the public, Leland and others' activism, We Are the World, celebrities, that forced Reagan to pivot. And suddenly, Reagan becomes the one who had the idea. A hungry child knows no politics. He was very savvy in that way. Even, and I'll get to your 300 million in a second. Even the United States has a I think it's a 5-ton wheat reserve. And Mickey Leland came from the third delegation to the Horn, I believe, in the second one that he led in '84. And he wanted to get this wheat reserve that none of us will ever eat. It's just we pay farmers to store the wheat in there and keep prices low, and it just sits there. In case we have a mass emergency, then we use it, but it's not gonna happen, never happens. So Congressman Leland looks at this wheat reserve and says, we could just use this.
It's more than 5 tons, right? How many?
I thought it was 5 tons. Maybe it
I
changes.
just tend to think it's more than that, but okay.
Perhaps it's more. The idea is a lot, more than we can use.
Right.
And so Congressman Leland says, let's use this for famine relief in the Horn and in the Sahel. And Reagan is vehemently against it. Absolutely not. In fact, he says, according to the laws, this must be used domestically, and Leland's office got back there and said, no, in fact, when it was set up by Kennedy in the 1960s, it could be used for any emergency the president deems fit. So Congressman Leland's threatening to have protests. Other congressmen are lobbying to get this wheat reserve used. Finally, Reagan comes around and it becomes his idea. He has a signing ceremony where he's celebrating this idea of using the wheat reserve for famine relief. That's how he would get ahead of it. And Leland was invited to the signing ceremony, but was not really thanked there. But that's the power he's having behind the scenes. Very few people know that story. But it's a huge and impactful moment. Behind the scenes, he's doing these things. So as I understand it, that's one of several examples of how he's working behind the scenes. He's also slowly lobbying to raise the budget for food aid to all of Africa. And he, not alone, but with some of his colleagues, Tony Hall and others, Emerson, they pushed through $800 million for Africa, which was historic. About 300 plus was going to go to the Horn. And so we're going from zero to almost $1 billion in about 4 years. Again, this is, I think, some of his skills that Congressman Leland built here in Houston, working with and for the Demonil family, talking to community leaders, bringing them on board for projects, going behind the scenes, and shaping the narrative behind the scenes. And that becomes the public narrative. He brings that to Congress. Wasn't like Dellums out there making speeches. Gray was the legislative, Congressman Gray from Pennsylvania was the legislative genius. Congressman Leland was behind the scenes, talking to people. His hearings with the select committee were well attended because he would go door to door, come to my hearing, and he would corral people in that way. And again, shaping the narrative, forming study groups. So he didn't do it single-handedly, and that's part of the point, is that he's working with others to craft legislation, push the budget up, and raise the profile of African issues.
Now, your second chapter is entitled Redefining Black Politics, Third World Spirit, and Black Internationalism in Congress. Speak a little more than that.
So that's my controversial argument. I'm arguing in that chapter that, and I mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating, that this is the first generation, not just in Congress, but in mayor's office, such as Hatcher in Gary, Indiana, in Newark, in city councils, where Black power activists who stand in solidarity with the Global South, grassroots organizers, are entering electoral politics, so bringing those sensibilities with them. One of the arguments I'm making in that chapter and in a later chapter and in this Land of Plenty is that the mid-1980s was the high watermark of Black power. Never before or since have African Americans exercised such influence in domestic and foreign affairs. And I'm suggesting it's because of Africa, particularly because of South Africa. South Africa was a unifying factor. And they're bringing these organizing strategies from Black power into the halls of power. And again, changing the United States' position towards South Africa, raising the budget for Africa in general. These are folks, Congressman Leland and Ron Dellums of Oakland, sending notes of solidarity to the Sandinistas, who Reagan is funding an illegal Contra movement to try to undermine, sending notes of solidarity to Fidel Castro in Cuba, making trips to Cuba, and shaping public opinion. And so one would argue that, well, Ben, you're saying that 1984-85, when we had the anti-apartheid legislation, was the high watermark of Black power. Well, what about Condoleezza Rice? What about Colin Powell? What about Barack Obama? These are all African Americans who are very powerful. What I'm arguing in this Land of Plenty is that Leland and others represent the high watermark of Black power in this country. Never before or since have we had this much power. It's because these folks were acting self-consciously as African Americans in solidarity with the Global South. With Obama and others in the 2000s, they are holding great positions of political influence, but they're not acting self-consciously as African Americans. They're acting as Americans, and rightly so. And we lose something when we don't have African American elected officials engaged in international affairs who are self-consciously tied to other Global South movements and who aren't acting self-consciously as African Americans. It's this one moment, I'm arguing, in the 1980s when we have this cohort that think of themselves in that way. African Americans in solidarity with other movements around the world. As Leland would say, he was not just a resident of Houston and a citizen of the United States. He's a citizen of humanity. Everywhere there is want in this world, that's my constituency.
Now, your concluding chapter is the tragic demise of third world politics in the United States. And before we begin to take a few questions, if anybody in our audience has some questions, I'd like you to speak to that. That's a sad conclusion.
It is a sad conclusion. It's part of what I've been saying about the ways that the importance of being engaged internationally and using that for influence domestically, where we just don't have that anymore. Again, with many of the events of the 1990s, with the exception of Haiti, the Congressional Black Caucus didn't respond. One of the sole voices there, Barbara Lee was there, and Donald Payne of New Jersey was there, shaping the ways in which Bush is going to respond, or Clinton's going to respond to Somalia. Bush, then Clinton's going to respond to Somalia. Trans-Africa is still there, influencing Somalia and Haiti, but again, there's no consensus. No one can agree. We have some Congress people who want to support Abacha in Nigeria, other people want to call for sanctions. Some people who want Bush to go into Somalia, some people say we should stay out of Somalia. We don't want a military humanitarian intervention. There's no consensus. Once South Africa has multiracial elections in '84, agreement has dissipated among African American elected officials. Haiti was an exception. They came together on Haiti. Again, that's more of a racial issue. We're letting Cubans come into this country with the wet foot policy. They get asylum, where Haitians are being turned back. And so the Congressional Black Caucus in Trans-Africa say that's racist. Effective glue tying them together. Since then, if you look at the Congressional Black Caucus's website and you go to Legislative Weekend, used to be weekend, now it's week, Africa doesn't exist, except for bring our girls back. Few statements on that. Few statements that look a lot like the Democratic Party statements on development in Africa. We no longer have Trans-Africa, the largest and most important African-American-led lobby on foreign affairs in this country. We no longer have that. So Africa has disappeared. International affairs has largely disappeared. And again, the argument that I'm making in this land of plenty is that it's through international affairs, particularly toward Africa, but the Global South generally, that provided a platform for African Americans to exercise outsized influence in electoral politics. And we can't forget Jesse Jackson as well, with his 2 historic campaigns, spoke directly about African affairs, particularly South Africa. I've listened to the debates, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Warren, Biden, no one's talking about Africa. We have some folks talking about Puerto Rico and the tragic response that we've had and the deliberate refusal to release aid there. But the Congressional Black Caucus has largely been silent.
Let's open it up for some questions from the audience, perhaps some of our students or faculty. We have a microphone. Dr. Rodriguez.
Doctor, what was the most surprising thing you learned about either Congressman Leland or the issues that he focused on through your research?
Thank you for that. The easy response is one of the surprising things I learned riding in this land of plenty and writing about Mickey Leland is just how much I did not know about the 70s and the 1980s. I mean, there was so much going on in international affairs that African American elected officials were paying attention to, and I just was not aware of that. I did not know how important Cuba continued to be in the 80s for African American elected officials, and particularly Leland Dellums paying attention to Latin America as well. I knew about Africa because of Trans-Africa and the Black Caucus's fight against U.S. support for the apartheid regime, but I didn't know how much they were paying attention to Latin America. And Congressman Leland allowed activists to use his Houston office to organize humanitarian missions going toward Nicaragua and El Salvador. He made his office available, and I think he released some funds to push for trucks, because the Reagan administration tried to block trucks from going across the border. They called it, they're supporting a terrorist government. supporting terrorists in Latin America. But it was Leland's office that was the headquarters for a little while. So it's a lot of small things like that. So what I have come to appreciate after writing about Leland and writing about the 1980s, we have these big events. Jesse Jackson, we know about what he was doing with his campaigns. We know about many of the activists in the 60s who were large, but people like Leland who were largely behind the scenes, and just how incredibly important that is, and to be in these multiple lanes. So I just had to learn how complex these issues were, and the complexity of the response, and the necessary engagement of people like Congressman Leland.
All right, Brandon Andrews, EMPA student here. My question would be, how would Mickey Leland interpret or evaluate the current immigration crisis that we have, domestic and internationally?
Thank you for that. Historians always use the scapegoat of, as a historian, I cannot comment on contemporary issues, but I'm not gonna go that route. I am positive, and Brother Judon could speak to it as well, with not just Leland, but people like his generation. The African American elected officials would be speaking loudly against the crisis that has been created, fabricated, and then created on the border. The language we're using to speak about immigration, just the language in general. One of the things they did that was so effective in the 1980s was they used the microphone. The saying was, politician has never seen a microphone they didn't love, but it was very effective. Those pushing for meetings with the president, even when they were denied, they would hold a press conference. And so shaping the narrative, as I've said before, is very, very important. It does not resolve the issue. I don't think they would have been able to solve not particularly with this Senate, but at least they would have been speaking out, and we would have been more aware. When I was a teenager, I knew who the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus was, because they were constantly holding press conferences, constantly speaking and protesting. We have these two together. But what we're missing now that we had then, that would have spoke to us directly about immigration. A lot of these folks coming through are not just folks from Nicaragua and El Salvador. A few are from Mexico, but Africans are now coming through the southern and the northern border. We had a local press. The black press was strong in the 1980s. And we don't have the black press in the same way that could articulate ways in which this crisis, those folks seeking asylum, is significant to the African American community. So we had journalists who were engaged in that way that we don't have now. That's not the only reason for the disengagement, but that's, I think, one of the reasons. So I'm sure, to put it short, that Congressman Leland and Dellums and Gray and Payne, Barbara Lee, who's still there, who's speaking out. She's one of the few people, I think, Congressman Lee as well, speaking out on these issues. But he would have been outraged, and he would have expressed his outrage. He probably would have organized a protest on the Capitol steps. In fact, I'm sure he would have.
Probably would have gone down to the border.
He probably would have gone down to
Certainly,
the border.
I think the analysis is correct, and it's quite thought-provoking, both your assessment of our lack of involvement in international affairs. I'm talking about as a political and social movement. And the idea of the separation of families at the border is, so humanely outrageous, in addition to the wall. And the fact that they've lost so many children from these families who are left so much to fend for themselves. And in the context of, we now have so many multiple media sites, news and information sites with the internet, beyond 3 national networks to like an explosion of 10 or 12, and less information.
That's right.
And less clarity.
That's right.
And more confusion.
That's right. And I think, this is the strategy I believe he or someone like him of his generation would have done, because this is what they were doing. It's not just going down to the border, which I think you're right. He would have done that. He would have done that. But he also would, again, formed an ad hoc study group to gather the material. That's why the archive is so full of all these reports. he would have gotten some committee together, an ad hoc committee, to get the facts together. Then he would have had his talking points, informed himself. He was not going to read a big brief. He wasn't going to do that. But he would read the talking points, and then he'd go down to the border. And he'd also hold some press conferences to raise the awareness of what's going on down there, for sure.
Patrick, and then I think the Associate Dean has a...
I had one question, and that was about his relationship with the other leaders, and specifically in the African countries. How did they view him? Did you run across any specific dialogue as far as these other African country leaders and how they responded to him so well in helping him to achieve his mission and what he wanted to do within their borders?
Yeah, I think this is also something that he did rather quietly, is to have these relations, probably most famously with Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia, who would invite him to Jubilee Palace when he was in Ethiopia, wrote op-eds about Mickey Leland that you could read in the Ethiopian Herald, but also leaders in Latin America, most famously Fidel Castro, who he visited personally with. And as I understand it, Mickey Leland was the only contact Fidel Castro had, or direct contact of any elected official in the United States of America.
That's right.
He was speaking directly with at least his office, if not with him directly. But just an example of how he would quietly go about his business of affecting change. One example is in 1989, when in the Sudanese Civil War, there's a refugee crisis there and a food crisis in southern Sudan. The UN announces they're going to do Operation Lifeline Sudan, which is going to bring food from the East African ports of Mombasa, and I believe it was in Ethiopia as well. Massive movement of food to southern Sudan. But we had to get all those heads of state, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sudan, and all the rebel groups as well. And I'm not going to go through all the acronyms. So that was Leland's sixth delegation he took, was to go out there and meet with his contacts. And they all met with him, all those heads of states, from Moi, Mengistu, in Sudan, and also the rebel leaders. He met with Garang, the Sudan People's Liberation Army. So he's meeting with all these folks rather quietly and got all of them to agree on paper that they're going to allow this aid to flow through. So it's the connections he's making, and also the fact that they trust Mickey Leland. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that his personality, he's a very charismatic personality, but also his politics, his ethos. They did not see him just as an American politician, which he was. He was also proudly a Texan, Houstonian, but he was someone who stood, again, in solidarity with all these movements. And they understood that he was not just in Congress representing American interests, 18th District interest. He was representing Global South interests. He's speaking for Tanzania, for Ethiopia, for Sudan, for Cuba. And I think he believed in it, and they understood that, so they trusted him. So it's that quiet diplomacy that he was doing behind the scenes that allowed him to be so effective.
Dean? Oh, go ahead.
So, what's your motivation for writing this book? And in the course of writing the book, what were your greatest challenges?
Wonderful. That's a wonderful question. My motivation, I have many motivations. One of my motivations is slightly selfish, self-centered. This is my period that I grew up in, the 1980s. And the question I began with is the question that has haunted me as an adult. I was a young person who was obsessed with Africa and African politics and African culture. And it was around me. And then the fact that it's missing. So part of writing this is missing now. So part of my motivation was to understand why, really. Africa does not loom as large as it once used to loom in our popular culture and in our politics. Another motivation was that Mickey Leland, quite frankly, haunted me from the day I discovered him missing as a 15-year-old watching NBC News. And then to discover 25 years later, when I Google him, the Leland Center pops up. There's a fellowship that pops up. Few things pop up. The Wikipedia site at the time was about 5 lines. So I was motivated to tell his story, again, as a way of talking about the 1980s. And again, that floats right back to me because I'm a product of the 1970s and 1980s. As an academic as well, I just had a lot of questions about the Cold War, about activism, about the anti-apartheid movement that I think needed to be addressed in a comprehensive way, also in an accessible way, in a readable way. And Mickey Leland helped me tackle those issues as well. The biggest challenge, you asked? The biggest challenge really was, because we met, I guess it's about 8 years ago now, the biggest challenge was having the time. I'm a full-time professor and a full-time father. I envy people who are just writers. Well, I'm teaching classes, I'm advising graduate students, advising undergrads, traveling around, doing conferences. I would have 5 months where I'd work on it, then I wouldn't touch it again for 6, 7 months. So that was a challenge. And then to come right back to it. So finding the time to really think through it was tough. And I'm dealing with so many issues, keeping Leland at the center also, using him as a thread. We could sit down. There are so many challenges. It was hard, but I think the reward is more than worth the effort.
Dean?
Professor Dalton, I commend you for bringing to bear Congressman Mickey Leland's legacy on 1, humanitarianism, 2, anti-racism, 3, moral leadership into the land of plenty. The young man that asked you the question before this one took my question. Maybe he read my mind. But in any event, what is the takeaway from the land of plenty?
Thank you for that. I think you guys share. He didn't take the question. You guys are sharing the question, right? So one takeaway is that, 1, Congressman Leland's story needs to be told. He's an exemplar politician. He was an exemplar, I think, citizen of Houston, of Texas, of the world. He's an example worth emulating and following. Another takeaway is that the 1980s was significant. We can't just fold it into the 1960s and 1970s. It was a period in and of itself that we need to learn from, and that is shaping us right now. And it's a moment in which, through a combination of tactics and factors and context matters, African Americans were using electoral politics in a very effective way, because they were combining it with protest, combining it with coalition building, combining it with educating themselves and study, combining it with positive, progressive propaganda to be effective. So I think if we study the 1980s, we can see where we've come from, and we can see what we're lacking now. Because I'm arguing in this book, in this Land of Plenty, in the Tragic Demise chapter, that we're just not as effective in politics as we used to be. Again, we have influential members of Congress. We had, under Obama, an African-American president. But we no longer have this small but impactful group that's self-consciously acting as African-Americans, on African-Americans' behalf, tying themselves to Global South movement. So I think we need to study this period a little more. And I hope there's plenty of room in the archive for people to come after me and correct what I've gotten wrong and build on what I've gotten right.
On that note, I want to say thank you extremely much, Professor Tarleton, and thank you for those who are here. Professor Tarleton will take a few moments and he will sign some books if those of you who like to purchase a book right now. The Mickey Leland Center will indeed, the books you signed, we have here, we will purchase those for the Mickey Leland Center, because I think an opportunity might actually exist, because we do have an international relations class. We may have a book prepared for us from the Mickey Leland Center we can promote through our associate dean, and we can possibly use your text. So on that, thank you for being here. We have some refreshments outside. Professor Tarleton will be at the desk where his books are located, and if you want a book signed today, you can have it signed today. Again, round of applause to both of you and Arnold Julian Boney.
Let's sign some books.